welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be exploring a pretty chilling period in history that you might not be familiar with, but one that has had a pretty profound impact on the world. We're going to be talking about the brutal suppression of left-leaning movements during the Cold War. And, it's often referred to as the Jakarta Method. We're going to be using Vincent Bevins' book, The Jakarta Method, as our guide.
Yeah, this isn't about like some, formal CIA manual tucked away in a vault somewhere. The term Jakarta Method really emerged as a kind of shorthand to describe a pattern of violence and repression that was tragically effective, and as we'll discuss, became a blueprint for similar events in other parts of the world.
And what's so fascinating about Bevins' work is that he connects the dots between these seemingly disparate events and shows how the Cold War was experienced so differently depending on where you stood in the world.
Absolutely. To really grasp the implications of the Jakarta Method, we need to rewind the clock a bit to the early days of the Cold War. It was a period marked by intense anxiety, especially in the U.S., about the spread of communism.
And this is where the Truman Doctrine comes in, right? This basically set the stage for U.S. interventionism all around the globe.
Exactly. The Truman Doctrine really framed U.S. foreign policy as one of containment, pledging to support any government that was threatened by communist influence. But in practice, this often meant propping up dictators or undermining democratically elected leaders if their policies were perceived as too left-leaning.
So it wasn't really about promoting democracy then, but rather about ensuring U.S. interests, even if it meant sacrificing democratic principles along the way.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a key takeaway here. And we see this play out early on in places like Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954. In both of these cases, the U.S. intervened to overthrow governments that weren't even communist, but simply pursuing policies that challenged U.S. economic or political dominance.
And this is where it gets really thought-provoking, because Bevins argues that these early interventions had a ripple effect across what we call the global South, shaping the way that newly independent nations viewed the United States.
Yeah, you see these nations, many of which had just thrown off the yoke of colonialism, were looking for a different path, one that didn't involve just swapping one superpower for another. They wanted genuine independence, and they were wary of the U.S.'s actions.
And one of the leaders who really embodied this desire for a non-aligned path was Indonesia's first president, Sukarno. He emerges as a key figure in Bevins' book.
Sukarno was a charismatic leader with a vision for Indonesia that went beyond that Cold War binary. He saw Indonesia as a potential bridge between East and West and championed this idea of a third world movement, a group of nations that would stand together and chart their own course.
And this is where the Bandung Conference in 1955 becomes so important. This gathering of Asian and African leaders was a pivotal moment for the Third World. It was a chance to assert their independence on the global stage.
Yeah, and what's striking is how Bevins contrasts the reception of the conference in different parts of the world. While it was celebrated as this moment of solidarity in the Third World, it was met with suspicion, even disdain, in Washington.
It's like looking through two different lenses. The U.S. saw the conference as this potential breeding ground for communist influence, while the attendees saw it as an opportunity to break free from the constraints of the Cold War.
And this difference in perception is so crucial for understanding how events unfolded. As Indonesia, under Sukarno's leadership, began to lean further to the left, aligning itself with communist China and pursuing policies that challenged Western interests, alarm bells started ringing in Washington.
Even though the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, was gaining popularity through peaceful democratic means, it was still perceived as a threat by the U.S.
Right. The PKI was actually one of the largest communist parties in the world at the time, but it was committed to achieving its goals through elections and political participation. Ironically, both Moscow and the PKI's own leader cautioned against armed struggle. They saw it as counterproductive.
But this nuance was lost on U.S. policymakers who saw Indonesia as a domino waiting to fall, and they were determined to prevent that from happening.
And that determination led to a series of disastrous decisions. In 1958, the CIA launched this covert operation that was aimed at destabilizing Indonesia. It included attempts to assassinate Sukarno and stir up internal rebellions.
Almost as if the U.S. was so focused on preventing a communist takeover that they failed to grasp the complexities of Indonesian politics. They underestimated Sukarno's popularity and the deep-seated resentment these actions would generate.
And Bevins argues that this backfired spectacularly. Instead of weakening Sukarno, the CIA's intervention strengthened his hand. It fueled anti-U.S. sentiment and deepened Sukarno's distrust of the West.
So the U.S.'s actions had the opposite of their intended effect. pushing Indonesia further into the communist camp.
Precisely. And this dynamic where U.S. intervention backfires and actually strengthens the forces it aims to contain is a recurring theme in Bevins's book.
It's a pattern that has implications not just for Indonesia, but for the broader Cold War narrative. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive, exploring how the Jakarta Method emerged from this really complex web of events.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Jakarta Method. In part 1, we set the stage for the events that would unfold in Indonesia in 1965. We saw how early U.S. interventions like those in Iran and Guatemala fueled this mistrust in the global south, and how the U.S.'s attempt to undermine Sukarno in Indonesia really backfired spectacularly.
Yeah, it seems like a classic case of miscalculation, wouldn't you say? The U.S., driven by this fear of communism, they ended up creating the very conditions that would lead to the violence they were trying to prevent.
Exactly. And to understand how the Jakarta Method emerged, we need to shift our focus briefly to another country that was grappling with its own Cold War anxieties, Brazil.
This is where Jango Goulart, or Django, comes into the picture, right? He was Brazil's president in the early 1960s, and a figure who, like Sukarno, represented a challenge to U.S. hegemony in the region.
That's right. Django was a left-leaning leader who championed social reforms, and he sought to reduce Brazil's dependence on foreign capital. He wasn't a communist, but his policies alarmed the U.S. They saw him as a potential threat to U.S. interests.
And this is where we see the influence of modernization theory, which was a dominant ideology among U.S. policymakers at the time. It basically argued that economic development was the key to preventing the spread of communism, and that the military often played a crucial role in this process.
Yes, modernization theory provided a framework for U.S. interventionism, and in Brazil, it led to the U.S. backing a military coup in 1964 that ousted Django from power.
So we see this pattern repeating itself. A democratically elected leader who is perceived as a threat to U.S. interests is removed from power with the support of the U.S. It's a chilling reminder of how Cold War ideology often trumped democratic principles.
And what's crucial for understanding the Jakarta Method is that this wasn't just about individual leaders or specific countries. It was about a broader strategy to eliminate any potential challenge to U.S. dominance, whether it came from communist socialists or anyone else who dared to question the U.S.'s vision for the world.
So with these coups in the background, let's return to Indonesia. Tensions were escalating in the early 1960s, fueled by Sukarno's increasingly anti-Western rhetoric and Indonesia's confrontation with Malaysia. Then in 1965, a pivotal event occurs, the killing of 6 Indonesian generals.
The events of September 30th, 1965 are still shrouded in mystery. What we know is that 6 high-ranking generals were killed, and the circumstances surrounding their deaths remain unclear.
This is where General Suharto enters the scene. He was an ambitious military leader who seized upon this moment to consolidate his power.
Suharto was quick to blame the PKI for the generals' deaths, claiming that it was part of a communist coup attempt. He then unleashed this wave of anti-communist propaganda, whipping up fear and hysteria across the country.
And this is where the Jakarta Method truly unfolds. Suharto used this manufactured crisis to justify a brutal crackdown on anyone suspected of communist sympathies.
What followed was one of the most horrific mass killings of the 20th century over the course of a few months. Hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered simply for being suspected of being communists or having leftist leanings.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom the scale of the violence. Bevins provides these chilling accounts from survivors, detailing the brutality of the killings, the widespread use of torture, and the destruction of entire communities.
And what makes this even more disturbing is the evidence Bevins presents suggesting that the U.S. government was not only aware of the killings, but actively supported them.
Wait, are you saying that the U.S. was complicit in these atrocities?
That's the implication, and it's one of the most unsettling revelations in Bevins' book. He reveals that the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta provided lists of suspected communists to the Indonesian military, essentially handing over targets for extermination.
This is a dark chapter in U.S. foreign policy, and it raises so many questions about the U.S.'s role in promoting violence and instability around the world.
And what's particularly chilling is that the events in Indonesia did not remain isolated. As Bevins argues, the Jakarta Method became a blueprint for repression, a model for crushing dissent that would be exported to other parts of the world, particularly Latin America.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the Jakarta Method. We've been exploring the horrific violence that unfolded in Indonesia in 1965 and how it became this model for repression that would be replicated in other parts of the world.
And as we delve into the global implications of the Jakarta Method, it's crucial to understand that this wasn't just about eliminating communists. It was about crushing any movement that challenged U.S. hegemony, whether it was advocating for social justice land reform or simply a more equitable distribution of wealth.
So the threat wasn't always communism per se, but rather any ideology or movement that challenged the U.S.-led global order.
That's a crucial insight, and it helps explain why the Jakarta Method resonated so strongly in Latin America, a region that had long been a target of U.S. interventionism.
One of the most chilling examples Bevins provides is the case of Chile under Augusto Pinochet, who came to power in a U.S.-backed coup in 1973.
Pinochet's regime was brutally repressive, and Bevins reveals how the term Jakarta itself became this chilling shorthand for the violence that was to come. It was literally scrawled on walls as a warning to those who dared to oppose the regime.
It's a stark reminder of how language can be used to instill fear and normalize violence.
And Chile was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Bevins connects the dots between Indonesia and this wave of U.S.-backed dictatorships that swept across Latin America in the 1960s and 1970s.
This is where Operation Condor comes in, right? A coordinated campaign of repression involving multiple South American dictatorships.
Exactly. Operation Condor was essentially a transnational network of state terror with intelligence agencies from different countries collaborating to track down and eliminate leftist opponents. It involved assassinations, kidnappings, torture, and the disappearance of thousands of people.
It's like something out of a nightmare, and Bevins brings this dark chapter to life through the stories of survivors, individuals who endured unimaginable horrors and whose voices demand to be heard.
Yeah, these personal accounts are what make Bevins's book so powerful. He doesn't just present facts and figures. He forces us to confront the human cost of these policies, the shattered lives and families, and the lasting trauma that was inflicted by state-sponsored terror.
One of the questions that haunts me as I read Bevins's work is, how could this happen? How could the U.S., a nation that claims to champion democracy and human rights, be complicit in such atrocities?
It's a question that demands a reckoning with the dark side of U.S. foreign policy, with the ways in which Cold War ideology led to the prioritization of U.S. interests over the lives of countless individuals in the global South.
And it's not just about the past. Bevins makes a compelling case that the legacy of the Jakarta Method continues to shape our world today.
Yeah, he points to the enduring power of anti-communist rhetoric, which has often been repurposed to target any movement or ideology that challenges the status quo. We see this in the demonization of social justice movements, the labeling of environmental activists as radicals, and this persistent fear-mongering about socialism.
It's almost as if the playbook that was used to justify violence during the Cold War has been updated for the 21st century, with new enemies and new targets, but the same underlying logic of repression and control.
And one of the most disturbing aspects of this is how the tactics of disinformation and propaganda, which were so effectively deployed during the Cold War, have found new life in the digital age.
We see this in the rise of online misinformation, the manipulation of social media algorithms to spread propaganda, and the erosion of trust in traditional media outlets.
It's a reminder that the fight against authoritarianism is an ongoing struggle, one that requires vigilance, critical thinking, and a commitment to truth and justice.
Bevins' book serves as a powerful call to action, urging us to confront the ghosts of the past and to recognize the ways in which they continue to haunt our present day. It's a book that challenges us to be more critical of the narratives we're presented with, to question those in power, and to stand up for human rights and democratic values wherever they are threatened.
And for those of you who want to delve deeper into this crucial but often overlooked chapter of history, we highly recommend picking up a copy of the Jakarta Method. You'll find an affiliate link in the episode description.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to continue exploring these critical issues. And remember, the fight for a more just and equitable world requires us to be informed, engaged, and willing to challenge those who would seek to silence dissent and perpetuate these cycles of violence and oppression.